Welcome everyone to our wonderful Wednesday class meeting. We're going to be discussing some interesting things, and we'll go over the schedule in just a little bit for the year because I will be missing some summer stuff. Today we're going to be talking about the history of the Mikveh Israel. Just go over a synopsis. I think most of us are pretty familiar. And then in 2 weeks, because we have no class next week, we're going to go over the history of synagogues. And then at the end of July, because we won't have classes in the middle of July, we're going to go over the history of architecture for synagogues, which will be very interesting because we will talk a little bit about the architecture of the first colonial synagogues in America. It's very interesting to see difference, especially between Truro, Charleston, and us. So for those of you who are not familiar, and I think many of you are familiar with the history of our congregation, again, a brief synopsis. We are the third oldest synagogue in America, the oldest synagogue in the South, the second oldest religious institution in the state of Georgia. We're the first Ashkenazic synagogue in America. And according to me, we're the best synagogue in America. So that's a little bit of the basic history. And let's talk a little bit about why we're the first Ashkenazic and the third Sephardic. Most people don't realize that the big Ashkenazic immigration starts in the 1840s, which we discussed. There's a smaller one that begins at the end of the 18th century, 19th century, but for a good portion of the 18th, 17th, and 16th century and 15th century, late 15th century, most of the Jews who came to America were Sephardic because Jews in the Sephardic world in Europe were part of the world. Like Jews in Amsterdam were living with non-Jews, although there was some isolation, whereas the Ashkenazic Jews were usually in ghettos or shtetls, so they didn't have the kind of freedom or education. So a lot of the Jews who came to America were kind of the more adventurous types who had been living in the world as Sephardim. So they came as fur traders, as adventurers, as traders, as hunters, as guides looking for new areas. And then, of course, eventually they'll kind of move into the fields we know of. So in 1733, the Jews who arrived in Savannah were a little different because it was a boat of 41 people. All of them but two families were Sephardic refugees from Portugal who had escaped to England and then came to America. There were two Jewish German families that had also but had moved to England. And the Portuguese Jews and these two German families didn't quite fit in. The Portuguese Jews had escaped Portugal, led by this man, Samuel Nunez. I think many of us know his name. He was a prominent doctor to the Grand Inquisitor himself and had treated the king. His nephew was the doctor to Catherine the Great. So he was a very prominent person, and then he was caught being a converso, that is somebody who was Jewish, a hidden Jew. He was caught because one of the political rivals, snuck in somebody into his staff, and that's how he was caught. But because he was so prominent, he was not killed. He was put under house arrest. And so one day he basically had a little bit of a dinner party for himself and some other people who were also conversos, some who had been caught. And there just happened to be an English captain who was in port and invited him on the boat. So they took some food and they went on the boat and they went to England. And that's how they escaped to England. So of course they got to England and have all of their money because they only had basically what they put in the baskets or sewed into their clothes because they were under watch. And they didn't quite fit in. So after a few years, the synagogue in England, Bevis Marks, which is the oldest synagogue in England. In 1290, Jews were kicked out of England. And in the 1750s, Oliver Cromwell came into prominence and invited them back. And so the first synagogue to be started after Jews were invited back was Bevis Marks, which is our mother synagogue. So they sponsored this trip. They arrive in Savannah, although they had left before the original boat to get to Savannah, the original settlers here. They arrived much later for various reasons. Savannah had been founded in 1733 in February. And on July 11th, this boat of 41 Jews, 42 had left, but one had died on the way. 41 Jews arrived on the shores. Wasn't really the shores, because we were way high up. And this was the largest immigration of Jews to America at this point. Now, usually a group like this would probably not be allowed onto land or certainly not become part of the community, but a variety of factors really helped this group of Jews become part of the community. It was a fortuitous moment, ironically, for a couple reasons. One, there was an epidemic that was devastating the community, threatened it to kill everybody or people to leave and go back to England. And of course, on the boat was a prominent doctor. So the doctor of the community here had been killed or died of the pandemic. And so Samuel Nunez came on and treated the community. And that was one of the reasons the Jews were allowed to join this new community, this new colony. Now, the other reasons they were allowed to join is the official rules of the community stated that the people who were not allowed to settle there were Papists or Catholics, because Spain controlled Florida and Savannah was created as a way to protect Charleston from Spain. There were no lawyers allowed, no slave owners allowed, and there was no alcohol allowed. So there was no official rule that said Jews were not allowed. It was understood, but it was not an official law. And so James Oglethorpe, who had founded the colony, was very enlightened. And so he gave them full rights when they arrived, which had never happened before. They were given the same type of house as everybody else, the same type of garden, the same type of farmland. And not only that, the men were required to serve in the militia, which was unheard of for Jews to be able to serve in the militia. One time previously, someone had sued in New York to be part of the militia, but this is the first time not only invited, but required. So Jews have always had full rights in Georgia. We think we're the only one of the original 13 colonies in which Jews have always had full rights. Interestingly enough, the heads of the charter, the people who were in charge of the charter for Savannah, did not want Jews to be here. So when Oglethorpe sent notes to them asking if it was okay for the Jews to be here, by the time the letters got back to Oglethorpe saying no Jews allowed, they had already been given their homes, they had already been promised all these things. And so because Oglethorpe was a little bit more enlightened, they were allowed to stay, just like, yes, Larry.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. Go on.
No, please go ahead. Questions are better.
I was just curious, do we know why they decided to come to Savannah? I mean, there were already Jewish settlements in Philadelphia and in New York, obviously. The Dutch had some settlements there. They were not, I guess they knew they would not be totally welcomed, right? They didn't know that
they did not know. There's some debate as to whether they were purposefully coming to this charter or going to other places and were not allowed to get off the boat in other places.
Oh.
So they could have, we think, stopped off in one or two places and were not allowed off, basically. There were Jewish communities. There was one in New York already. Obviously, the one in Rhode Island, I think, had become defunct a little bit. I forgot when Rhode Island became defunct. And of course, Charleston had Jews, but they didn't have an official community. There were only two Jewish synagogues. There were only two synagogues in America up to this point, obviously, New York, but they were not going to that area. So some believe they were coming here purposefully because there was a new charter and they thought Oglethorpe would allow them to come on. But I don't think we have definitive proof of either way, or if we'd have to look up and see. Stuart.
Rabbi, are you using synagogue as synonymous with congregation or with building or?
With the congregation,
Okay.
So, because we didn't have a building till 1820. So there were Jews in America, but nobody had set up like a Jewish congregation or a house of worship, except for in New York and in Rhode Island.
Oh.
So now in Savannah, some of the other restrictions were lifted as well. For instance, no alcohol, that restriction was lifted pretty early on. Why? Because sailors would not come to Savannah if there was no alcohol. They didn't want to get off the boat. There was no reason. So that basically forced Savannah to create bars along the river so that the sailors could go to them. In fact, Abigail Minus, a very prominent Jewish woman, owned one of those more prominent bars there, which is interesting. She's probably the most famous member of our congregation. Obviously, they had to have lawyers for business. They had to have, unfortunately, slaves to compete with Charleston. So we did have slaves fairly soon afterwards, alcohol, and a little bit later on, Catholics were welcome here as well. Of course, the Irish Catholics became a very prominent part of this community in the 19th century. So in 1733, they're allowed on, they form Mikveh Israel, and which is the hope of Israel, and were founded as both an Ashkenazic and Sephardic community, which is almost unheard of. I don't know of any other time when this happened. As I said, the first two synagogues were Sephardic. There will not be another Ashkenazic synagogue in America until the 1790s, when one was opened in Philadelphia. So, in fact, there are letters from prominent Christian leaders about they don't understand why the Jews are always arguing about what they can eat. So it's probably during this time, because the Sephardic Jews and the Ashkenazic Jews come from different places. Sephardic Jews were generally a little bit more liberal. Ashkenazic Jews were a little bit more strict in terms of what they eat. So that may have been a big issue, but it wasn't. Larry.
So was the reason it became Ashkenazic, even though most of the 41 people you said, except for two, there were German Jews, it was because of those two German Jews?
Yeah, the two German Jewish families. However, in 1737, only 4 years later, Bevis Marx sponsored another group of people to move here, and they were all German Jews. So in 1737, we ended up having almost an equal number of Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews. So, Flossie.
What was the name of our sister synagogue again? Could you spell it?
Our mother synagogue is Bevis Marx. It's in London. It's still there. Not the original building, but the building, they still have a synagogue there.
Mother synagogue.
It's like the Mother Synagogue of England as well, and for us.
Thank you.
And we also weren't the first Mikveh Israel because there was already a Mikveh Israel in the Bahamas. Yes, Noah.
Yes, were German Jews thought of as a higher level of being Jewish than the other Jews?
Not at this time. And remember, we're predating the German, Germany became a center for Jewish learning, modern learning, education, but that's not till the 19th century after Napoleon. So in the 18th century, there were still Jews living in the world, but a lot of Jews most of the Jews were living in isolated Ashkenazic enclaves. Now, in Holland, for instance, there were Jews who were much more part of the world, but the Ashkenazic would really not become part of the modern world until the 19th century.
Do we know much about the 41 original Jews aside from the doctor? I know that, Oglethorpe's goal was that you had to be a productive part of society, right, and, not necessarily well-educated, but, you had to be a soldier or somebody who could defend themselves or farm or build things.
Yeah, we do have information on all of them. We have a lot of information from when they arrived, not as much information from beforehand. But we kept documents from the beginning. The issue is in 1742, there was a war between Spain and England called the War of Jenkins' Ear. And all of the Sephardic Jews believed, probably correctly, that if Savannah was captured, which was very likely, that they would all be killed, the entire families, because they had left the Inquisition, illegally, because remember, Spain and Portugal were Spain was probably basically at this time period almost, in charge of Portugal. And so they had left illegally, so they all left town. So in 1742, the only Jews in Savannah were Ashkenazic Jews. Now, through the next years after the war, they would have Sephardic Jews coming in and moving here. But all the Sephardic Jews left. A few of them went to Philadelphia and started Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, which became the fourth synagogue to be established in America. So the fourth synagogue and the third Mikveh Israel, there's one, I think the Mikveh Israel is in St. Thomas, somewhere in the Bahamas, was the first Mikveh Israel, we're the second, Philadelphia's third.
What year did you say the war of, and the name of that war?
The War is of Jenkins' ears because the guy got his ear cut off and sent. But the War of Jenkins' ears was in 1742.
Jenkins' ears.
Years.
Jenkins' ear, just one ear.
Years.
They only took away one. I mean, that's not funny. They cut off his ear, but anyway.
You said.
Yeah, I know they were terrified about, the colonists were terrified about protecting Charleston, and I think they made.
Oh, yeah.
Though Oglethorpe was governor of Georgia, I think his role was really as the commander of basically the whole colonial coast that went from Georgia all the way up through Virginia, because they were concerned that the Spanish boats that were coming up the coast from
Right.
Florida or from South America with the gold, because they had to make that turn before they got to North Carolina in order to capture winds and not get up to Cape Hatteras.
Oh, that I didn't know that part. That's
Yeah. So that was the trade winds, and they were getting very, very close to some of the places that we have right off of, Beaufort and Paris Island, at those places. As a matter of fact, Paris Island claims that they have the oldest settlement in the United States before the one that's in Florida, before the one in
St.
St.
Augustine.
Augustine, which is a military settlement, and they unearthed it, I think, on one of
Oh, really?
the eighth hole, I think, of the
Very
golf
cool.
course in Paris Island. Now they have some of the remnants of what they consider to be the first establishment, and it's a Spanish settlement.
Yeah,
There were Spanish settlements up and down the coast here.
Oh yeah, and all
Oh,
the
yeah?
way almost through Florida. I mean, Spain controlled all of Florida at this point.
yeah. Originally, Beaufort was the capital of the Spanish Empire there, not St. Augustine's. And then when it got raided by, I think it was Cabot, they abandoned the Beaufort location and moved it down to St. Augustine's.
Person.
Well, Port Royal was the main place because it was a deep water port. And
yeah,
you get into Port Royal, and then you can get fresh water. So it became a safe harbor, apparently, and that became a real crucial area for ships that were coming in from Cuba. Cuba was the other place that became very prominent with the Spanish. So they wanted to go either from Havana to come up here to Port Royal before they took the trade winds that came back to Europe.
Yeah, and again, Spain and England during this period were a lot of trade was going between them. Sometimes they were helping each other, sometimes they were not. At times, Spain would stop English boats and let French boats in. Spain was not happy when England founded Savannah, because I think, they thought England would be coming south and invading them eventually. So the War of Jenkins' ear is interesting because he had his ear cut off by Spanish soldiers who boarded and sent to England. And it was like 4 years later when they started the war. It's like 4 years later, we're very upset about this ear being cut off, but it happened years earlier. It was so obviously it was not the main reason. It was, they were going to go to war over something. And so the war lasted a while, but the central part of it was in 1742. And that's when the Jews left here.
And that's
So-
when it became Charleston, Philadelphia. You say that's when
A few went to
established
Philadelphia and helped found that synagogue. Some went to Richmond.
Same title, yeah, same name.
Some went to Richmond. I don't know if that, obviously Richmond was the sixth synagogue, but that wasn't founded until the 1780s. So I don't think they would have, they may not have been alive by that time period, or certainly not this
When they first established the congregation as a joint Sephardic and Ashkenazi, I mean, how did that work? It sounds a little like the government in Israel now, what was
Well,
the,
they basically prayed at homes. It sounds like they got along fairly well. But again, once the German Jews from Germany came in and you had a bulk, they probably would have ended up having two different synagogues. But with war and starting the colonies and praying in homes, they seem to have gotten along pretty well. And we're pretty appreciative of being here. But, that would have stopped years later probably. So, but that didn't happen. We did have Sephardic Jews coming here through the years because obviously most of the Jews coming to America are Sephardic, but the synagogue would remain mostly Ashkenazic, although they'd have some Sephardic prayers and things in there as well. So they had a little bit of mix. But again, the Jewish community here was very much smaller after 1742 because and it's probably from 1737 to 1742, we were the largest Jewish community in the country. And then after those Sephardic Jews left, probably Charleston was the largest Jewish community, and they'd be the largest Jewish community in America till probably the 1840s.
And the square that we're on right now, Monterey Square, was that given to them originally when they came here? And when did they build? And I know they built a synagogue there. When was that built?
Yeah, well, what happened? The Monterey Square was not here yet because that came years later. The map only goes like two squares deep, but we did not have a building until 1820. We just went to people's homes, possibly used churches, and just never felt the need to do that. So in 1820, we built our first building. And have you guys been to the Soho Grill by any chance? Downtown Savannah. It's off Liberty, I think. Yeah. Our first building was in their parking lot now. What is their parking lot?
Yeah.
Our second building was also in the parking lot because the first building burnt down in 1835, or it was either burnt down in 1835 or 1835. The second one was built because it was burnt down. And then we had our building from 1835 till we built our new one in 1878. The land we're on here was purchased by the community. It was not given to them.
Oh, so the site that we're on right now is not the original historical
No.
site of the, okay. I
No.
didn't know that.
They built this. It's a much bigger. They bought the section we're on. We're on two sections of land, and they bought both of them. One of them they left alone for a while before they built the social hall, but the sanctuary was finished in 1878. The social hall, the first one, I forgot when the first one, there's been three of them, I think, 3 or 4. I got to look that up. The most recent was 2003. That's the one we have now. So
2003.
now, as for what they did here, they were given full rights. And obviously, because of the educational background, Jews generally did really well in countries that gave them full rights. So they did fairly well here. And really were able to establish just about become part of almost any industry. There were very few restrictions upon their business. There may have been some, even clubs that usually would not allow Jews in Savannah usually did. There were some exceptions, but because we were so philanthropic, so prominent, so much part of the community, that really this has probably been one of the best places for Jews in this history of our country. And
That when they first came here, they prayed in people's homes,
right.
And so was there what you call a rabbi, or was there a lay teacher then, or?
Yeah, they had lay leaders. Sometimes they were called ministers. But remember, there are no rabbis in America till the 1840s. Excuse me. As I say, they call those the good old days. So each community, excuse me. Traditionally, a rabbi did not lead services. It was just anybody could lead services. So they had now lay people leading them. Now, some of them were, again, obviously the Sephardic were generally less religious. Mordechai Sheftel, Benjamin Sheftel, who was one of the first immigrants of those two Jewish families, was fairly religious. And so this city the Jewish community was a little bit more religious than other places. America remembers the Wild West. There's no rabbis. There's no pressure from any Jewish community. You don't have to do all of these things. Excuse me one second.
I know what that's like, don't I? Hmm?
Yeah.
Can I put the cream cheese away?
Yes.
All right, I'm back with cough drop in tow. Even though I'm feeling
Question,
fine, I don't know where that came from.
So even when they had the buildings in 1820, the first building you said, and then in 1835, when they rebuilt it in what's now the parking lot, you said at the Soho Grill, those were led by lace. There were no rabbis then till in the United States till 1840s.
To the 1840s, and our first rabbi here was in the 1860s.
Oh,
So remember, it was a Wild West for Jews. You could do anything. You could have mixed seating. You didn't have to do all the prayers. You didn't have to keep kosher the same way. You didn't have to follow the rules of a rabbi who made very strict ones. So there was a rabbi who toured America, I believe, in the 1780s. Excuse me one second. I do have him in my car. It's because I was going to stop by your house. Give me about 10 minutes and we'll finish here. You have 10 minutes?
15 before I meet her.
Okay, I'll be finished in 10 minutes. And if they get a ticket, then then Jennifer will pay for it. I need somebody to sign a certificate. So, yeah, there was a rabbi who came through America in the 1780s or 1790s, and he was apparently a brilliant speaker. I think he spoke at Truro and gave a 2-hour sermon that everybody said was amazing. Did you hear about that one, Jeff?
No, I hadn't.
He gave this amazing sermon that lasted 2 hours, even though not a single person understood a word because he was speaking a different language.
Was
You don't know, he may have been speaking Ladino. He was speaking a language that the congregation didn't understand. He spoke for 2 hours.
Rabbi, was anyone awake at the end?
They say it was an amazing one. He got rave reviews.
Okay.
That's amazing. He's the opposite of me. I speak the language of people in the sanctuary and I put them to sleep. He spoke a language nobody understood and was arousing. So now when the Jews were here with everybody else, again, they had their own farmland. So they were allowed to enlarge the holdings, which the two German families really did, the Minus and Scheftel families. Abigail Minus, if you go on and look at a list of most important Jewish women of the 18th century, she will probably be number one. Very prominent, supporter of the revolution, very wealthy. Her husband died. Instead of marrying somebody and giving the business to her husband, she stayed single and became very successful and one of the wealthiest women in America, helped support the revolution. As I said, owned a bar, owned a whole bunch of different businesses. Mordechai Scheftel, who was the first or second European born in Georgia. The first one was a Minus, became the highest ranking Jew in the military in the during the revolution. He was also very prominent. He was captured and spent the entire most of the revolution in jail with his son Scheftel, who were treated horribly because they were Jewish and refused to give their dire support of England. Jeff, did you have something?
No, I remember you told us that story one time about Scheftel, and it was the father's fault because he failed to teach him.
That's right.
Right.
Well, what happened was when the Battle of Savannah, Savannah was taken by England, and everybody went across the river. I believe it's the one that divides South Carolina and us. I forgot the name. It's not the Savannah River. I think it's a different one. And so all of the American forces went across, but Scheftel did not know how to swim. And so his father stayed on the other side with him. He was only 17 at the time. He was also kind of strange. He may have been like autistic, so he may not have had the ability to, but he was a very prominent lawyer when he came back. He's a very interesting character for a couple reasons. One, he died in the 1840s. He wore his Revolutionary War uniform for the rest of his life. So in the 1840s, remember the war ended in 1783. So 60 years later, he's still wearing his Revolutionary War uniform. So you walk around and see this guy with that giant hat, which the family still has. He's also interesting because it is the first and only recorded case of a premature chalitza. Do you guys know what a chalitza is? If I die before I have children, my brother is obligated to marry my wife and have children with her, and those children will be in my name. However, if my brother does not want to marry her, there's a ceremony where she throws a shoe at him, basically. But it happens after I die. It's after I die. So Sheftel was really strange. And so when his brother was getting married, his brother's fiance met Sheftel and required him to do a chalitza before the wedding. Because in case her husband died, she did not want to be married to her husband's brother. So they did a chalitza while he was still alive. That's how strange he was. So it's the only one in recorded history where that's happened. So that's a really interesting side note.
Rabbi, what is the history of this chalitza?
It's a biblical thing. It goes all the way back to the Bible. It is mentioned there, so it's used. There's not a lot of records on exactly how it was used, the ceremony, but there is some spitting involved and a shoe. So there's different ceremonies done. It's still done today in really traditional household communities. But I've never seen it done, but it is still done. And for obvious reasons, there's a lot of issues involved with it. If I die and my brother marries my wife and has children, even though they're officially my children, they may still have rights to his stuff. And so my brother's children with his other wife may be upset because these other children may now have a right to their inheritance. So it messes with the inheritance laws, basically. And so, and also in countries where they're not allowed multiple brides, that was an issue. But I think in America at the time, it was, I think, unofficial. You could do that. So it's still a rare thing done. And often it's done with a single brother as well. Like if your brother is single, that's usually when it's done. Or any other questions?
Yeah, just to get back a minute to the first rabbis. Europe then had rabbis in their congregations. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
At the time, and they had schools, rabbinical schools of sorts. I mean, where
Yeah,
they had an
unofficial.
ordained process, but where was the first rabbi then in America to serve in a congregation? Do you know which that was? Or
The first one, that's a good question. I don't know. That's a good question. I don't remember. I remember taking the class on it. Let's see. First I don't know when it is. I'll have to look that up. It's around 1740s. Isaac Mayer Wise was, of course, the most famous one because he founded the Reform movement. Let's see here. I'm going to look it up and see if I can find it real quick for you. It says Abraham Joseph Rice was the first rabbi to serve, and he immigrated in 1840, and he started serving in 1849, maybe I say.
Rice.
Was that Rice or Weiss?
Rice.
Interesting name.
So he tried to revive Truro Synagogue in the early 1840s. Then got a job in 1842, lost that, and then so he would be the first one, but it doesn't sound like he was super successful.
Where was he?
No, he was in first. Oops, sorry.
I have to say something to Larry. Larry,
yes,
are you listening?
I'm listening.
Do not
listening.
climb that ladder. Do you hear me?
All right. Thank you, Noel. Okay.
I don't want you to fall and break your skull.
Okay, thank you.
I love you too much.
All right, I'm going to take that away, so it's not going to be even a topic anymore.
What?
The ladder.
Oh,
You don't want Shane to climb it either.
Okay, I was just, yeah.
You were gonna say,
So he served in Truro. He tried to set up another synagogue there. Maryland. He started up a synagogue in Maryland, Har Sinai, after leaving Truro. Then he left there. He was a little bit more strict, probably. The problem with rabbis coming to America is the rabbis are all very traditional. And when you get to America, guess what?
No,
It's a different world. We are not used to having rabbis. You come to my congregation and say, we're going to do this, 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 and this. And the congregation says, no.
No.
And the rabbi's not used to that because in Europe, the rabbis have secular power given to them by the community. By the establishment. So in certain areas, the rabbi is given political and religious control, or just religious control, but you can't leave. And here they're not given that kind of control, and it was frustrating to them. So when they finally start coming over, it takes a while for them to get used to this kind of new wave freedom. First rabbinical schools in America are going to be till 1860. So
Now, we call ours the Board of Adjunta. Now, what is that all about?
that is just what it's been called the whole time. Why is it called the Board of Adjunta? That I do not know.
Instead of
I
Board
think a
of
lot of
Adjunta.
places are called that.
How is it spelled?
ADGUNTA.
Sounds like a Spanish word.
Yeah, it is. It's a Spanish Hebrew one, I think.
Ladino?
That I don't know.
J,
Let me look up.
add,
Adjunta, yeah.
Mhm.
or is it adjunct?
I don't know if it's Ladino. Oh my goodness! Guess what? How cool.
Ruling, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, the Board of Adjunta is used a lot of places. Adjunta means, see here. It means, I think that's what it means. So that's just, again, we keep a few of the original, from our original charter. The president's called the Parnas or the Parnasit, and we keep the name Board of Adjunta. And the Jewish Community Center is called the JEA, although that's not because of our origins. That's just because we like to be different.
And Ekantori, you call the choir.
Yeah. All right. So I have to go now, go get this guy to sign these things. We'll continue next week and talk about the history of the synagogues, and then we'll look at our synagogue when we talk about that.
Not next week.
Not next week, sorry, the week after. So there'll be no class till July 7th.
Okay. I'll move the ladder by then.
Yeah, be careful with the ladder.
Give me 2 weeks to move the ladder.
I want you to know when we build our sukkah, I do not go on the ladder. That's my wife's job.
Right, there you go.
Don't get
Am
on
I-
that ladder.
I have a great
Don't
job.
get on that ladder.
I have the great photo of my wife building the first sukkah when we moved into our new house. The first sukkah, nice sukkah we bought. I have a picture of her because it's really awesome, because I felt like as long as you're only 8.5 months pregnant, you should still build the sukkah by yourself. If you're 8 months and 3 weeks pregnant, then I will help you. So so that was nice of her. So I have a picture of my pregnant wife building our sukkah. Shabbat shalom. Not Shabbat shalom. So we'll see you guys in a couple of weeks. Stay safe. If you need anything, let us know. And
Yeah.
thanks again, everybody.
Have a nice vacation.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, bye-bye.